Ronan Barrett had no idea how he ended up in a yoga class full of women in brightly colored leggings, but the second he stepped inside, the sound of soft laughter made him freeze. It was light, teasing, completely unbothered by the fact that a 6'2" man in a perfectly tailored suit had just barged in like he owned the place. Wren Lawson, the instructor, stood at the front of the room, her hands on her hips, a playful sparkle in her hazel eyes as she looked at him. "Well, this is a new one," she said, tilting her head. "Did you take a wrong turn, or are you here for downward dog in a three-piece suit?" The class erupted into quiet giggles, but Wren didn't look embarrassed for him, just amused. Ronan, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, found himself momentarily speechless. He had, in fact, taken a wrong turn. He was supposed to be meeting a client at the high-end gym next door, but somehow he had wandered into this yoga studio instead. His assistant had texted him the address, but he must have misread it in his rush. Clearing his throat, he adjusted his cufflinks. "Clearly, I'm in the wrong place," he said smoothly, though his usual confidence felt slightly rattled under Wren's gaze. She grinned. "That depends. If you're looking for a business meeting, then yes. But if you want to stretch out that tension in your shoulders, you might actually be exactly where you need to be." More laughter rippled through the women in the studio, but Ronan barely heard it. His attention was locked on Wren. There was something about the way she carried herself, completely at ease, unshaken by his presence. He was used to people scrambling to accommodate him, nervous to speak in his presence. But Wren, she was teasing him like he was just another guy who'd walked in off the street. And somehow he found that refreshing. "I'll have to take a rain check," he said, allowing the corner of his mouth to lift slightly, "but I'll keep it in mind if I ever need to. Stretch." Wren laughed again, and he realized he liked the sound more than he should. "Well, if you ever change your mind, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday," she said, before turning back to her class. Ronan, for reasons he didn't completely understand, lingered for a second longer than necessary before finally stepping back out. But as he walked toward his real meeting, something about that moment stayed with him. He wasn't used to being laughed at, not in a way that felt good, and Wren Lawson, she had laughed without hesitation. Later that evening, Wren was finishing up at the cafe next to the studio when she heard a familiar deep voice. "I thought you'd be wearing yoga gear instead of an apron." She turned, surprised to see Ronan Barrett standing near the counter. He looked just as polished as before, but this time there was something different in his expression: curiosity. She arched a brow. "And I thought you'd be in a boardroom, not standing in a tiny cafe." His lips quirked. "Touché," he glanced around. "You work here too." "I own it," she corrected, wiping her hands on a towel. "The yoga studio and the cafe, they go hand in hand, you know." Ronan nodded, impressed. He wasn't sure why, but he hadn't expected that. Most people assumed he only surrounded himself with people who lived in his world: corporate giants, high-powered executives. But Wren was different. She had built something of her own, and there was something undeniably attractive about that. "You're full of surprises," he murmured. She shrugged. "You're the one who crashed my class in a suit, so maybe we're even." For a moment they just looked at each other, then Ronan did something completely uncharacteristic of himself. "Have dinner with me." Wren blinked. "What?" He wasn't even sure why he said it. He didn't date. He didn't have time for distractions. But something about the way she made him feel so effortlessly disarmed made him want to break his own rules. She studied him, clearly debating. She mused. "Will there be yoga involved?" Ronan chuckled, a genuine laugh he hadn't let slip in years. "Not unless you want to see me make a fool of myself," she grinned. "In that case, all right, but you're paying." He held out his hand. "Deal?" And just like that, Ronan Barrett, billionaire and master of control, realized he had just willingly walked into the one thing he had spent his life avoiding. Something real, something unexpected, and quite possibly something dangerous to his carefully structured world. Ronan had expected Wren to suggest a casual cafe, maybe something along the lines of the one she owned. Instead, She had chosen a tiny, hole-in-the-wall Italian restaurant tucked between two bustling city streets. It was warm inside, filled with the scent of garlic and freshly baked bread, with candlelit tables that made the whole place feel intimate despite the quiet hum of other diners. He had taken her to Michelin-starred restaurants, flown to Paris for a single meal before, but this was different. There was no pretension, no curated experience meant to impress. Just a woman sitting across from him, twirling a fork idly between her fingers, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "You're staring," she pointed out, amusement playing in her voice. Ronan leaned back slightly, unbothered. "You intrigue me," she laughed, shaking her head. "That is the most billionaire thing you could have said," his brows lifted. "What does that mean?" Wren rested her chin on her hand, studying him. "It means you're used to getting what you want. And right now you've decided you want to figure me out." He considered her words, then inclined his head. "You're not wrong," her lips curved. "I like honesty." Something about the way she said it made him pause. He wasn't sure if it was a simple statement or something deeper, a quiet challenge. The waiter arrived, setting down their plates before disappearing again. Wren took a bite of her pasta, humming in satisfaction. "So, Ronan Barrett," she said between bites. "Why were you in such a rush earlier that you ended up at my studio?" He twirled his glass of wine between his fingers briefly before answering. "Business meeting. An acquisition I've been working on for months. It's finally closing, but the last details needed to be ironed out." She nodded. "And in your rush to make millions more, you accidentally walked into a room full of people meditating." His lips twitched. "Something like that." Wren leaned forward slightly. "Do you ever stop?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" She gestured vaguely. "You strike me as someone who's always moving, always chasing the next thing. Do you ever take a moment just to exist?" Ronan exhaled slowly, realizing he didn't have a real answer. "I don't know if I'd know how." Her expression softened, and for the first time he felt exposed, not in a way that made him uncomfortable, but in a way that made him wonder when the last time was that someone had looked at him like that. Not as an asset, not as a force to be reckoned with, but as a person. Wren picked up her glass of wine. "Sounds exhausting." A small chuckle escaped him. "It can be." The way she studied him made him feel like she could see past the polished exterior, past the layers of control he had spent years constructing. It was unsettling, yet strangely grounding. "So," she said, breaking the moment with a teasing tone, "you never answered my question." "What question?" She smirked. "Are you ever going to take a yoga class, or was today a once-in-a-lifetime mistake?" He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "I don't see myself as the yoga type." She tilted her head. "That's exactly why you should try." Ronan took a sip of his wine, considering her. "You think people should do things they're bad at." "I think people should do things that force them to slow down," she corrected. "Even if it makes them uncomfortable." His jaw tensed slightly. "I don't do well with discomfort." "Then you're really going to hate yoga," she teased, grinning. He found himself laughing again, something that seemed to happen more around her than he was used to. The meal passed in easy conversation, her telling him about the cafe, the way she had spent years saving up to buy the space, how she had almost given up more than once. He found himself genuinely interested, asking about the struggles, the victories, the moments that had defined her journey. By the time they stepped outside, the city lights had turned the streets into a canvas of gold and silver reflections. Wren wrapped her arms around herself against the cool air, glancing up at him. "Well, this was fun," Ronan nodded. "It was." She hesitated for a brief second before smiling. "I should go." He wasn't ready for the night to end. "Let me drive you home," she laughed lightly. "I can take the train." Something about that answer didn't sit right with him. "It's late." She arched a brow. "I can handle myself, billionaire," he exhaled, realizing she wasn't going to budge. "At least let me walk you to the station." She grinned. "That I'll allow." They walked side by side, the city buzzing around them, but for the first time in a long time, Ronan wasn't thinking about deals or schedules. He was just there with Wren in a moment he hadn't planned for. When they reached the entrance to the station, she turned to face him. "You're not so bad, Ronan Barrett," he huffed a quiet laugh. "High praise." She stepped back toward the stairs, but before she disappeared down them, she called over her shoulder. "See you in yoga next week," he groaned. That wasn't a promise. She just winked and vanished into the station. Ronan stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, before shaking his head. Wren Lawson was unlike anyone he had ever met, and against his better judgment, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he saw her. Ronan wasn't sure how it happened, but by the following week, he was standing outside Wren's yoga studio in tailored athletic, wear that his assistant had rushed to purchase after his offhanded request. He had spent the entire day convincing himself that he had no business being there, yet somehow his feet had carried him to the door. Inside, Wren stood at the front, adjusting a mat and chatting with a few students. When she caught sight of him, her eyes lit up with unmistakable amusement. "Well, well," she mused, walking up to him. "I didn't actually think you'd show." Ronan exhaled through his nose, trying not to let his discomfort show. "Neither did I," she laughed, the sound warm and completely unbothered by his lack of enthusiasm. "Come on, billionaire. Let's see if you can survive 90 minutes without checking your phone." He had faced high-stakes negotiations, ruthless boardroom battles, and international scandals, but the next hour and a half tested his patience in a way nothing else had. His muscles, accustomed to lifting weights in tense office hours, protested with every stretch. The poses felt unnatural, his balance unsteady, and more than once he found himself faltering while Wren barely suppressed a grin. By the end of the class, as he lay on the mat staring at the ceiling, he heard Wren's voice above him. "Not bad, Barrett, you only fell over twice." He turned his head to look at her, unimpressed. "I don't see how anyone finds this relaxing." She sat beside him, pulling her knees up. "It's not about relaxing, it's about control, learning when to hold on and when to let go." There was something about the way she said it that made him pause. "Sounds a lot like business," he admitted. She smiled but didn't say anything, just let the silence settle. For the first time in years, Ronan allowed himself to do the same. 2 weeks passed, and somehow, Wren had become a fixture in his life. It started small, running into each other at her cafe, an occasional dinner when their schedules aligned. But what surprised Ronan the most was how easy things felt around her. She never asked about his wealth, never treated him like a business opportunity. She challenged him, teased him, and refused to let him dictate the pace of their interactions. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he found himself at her cafe again, watching as she wiped down the counter. "Rough day?" she asked without looking up. He loosened his tie, leaning against the counter. "You could say that." She glanced at him, eyes sharp with quiet understanding. "Want to talk about it?" Ronan wasn't used to discussing his stress, but with Wren, it didn't feel like an interrogation. Had a deal go sideways? "Someone I trusted turned out to be less reliable than I thought." She set the rag down and leaned her elbows on the counter. "That ever happened before?" "A few times." "So why does this one bother you?" He considered that. "Because I didn't see it coming." She nodded slowly. "That's the worst part, isn't it? When you realize you misread someone." For the first time, he noticed something in her expression, something guarded. "Has that happened to you?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "A while ago, yeah." Something about her tone made him curious, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small box. She eyed it warily. "What's that?" He placed it on the counter and slid it toward her. "Open it." Wren hesitated, then flipped the lid. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, simple yet elegant, her brows lifted. "What's this for?" Ronan shrugged. "You laughed at me when I fell in yoga last week." "Consider it compensation." She let out a quiet chuckle, running her fingers over the bracelet. "You do realize most people just accept embarrassment and move on, right?" "I don't do things like most people." She looked up at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "No, you don't." Then, without another word, she fastened the bracelet around her wrist. Ronan felt something shift in that moment, something unspoken but undeniable, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was in trouble. Ronan had been in countless high-pressure situations negotiating acquisitions, facing down ruthless competitors, making split-second decisions that affected millions of dollars. But standing outside Wren's cafe late one evening, waiting for her to lock up, he felt a different kind of anticipation. She emerged, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her bracelet catching the glow of the street lamp. He had given her that and she still wore it. That shouldn't have affected him as much as it did. "You didn't have to wait," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag. "I wanted to," he admitted. She studied him for a beat, then motioned toward the street. "Walk with me." They fell into step together, the city humming around them. It was late enough that the usual rush had died down, leaving the sidewalks quieter, the atmosphere softer. "You ever think about leaving the chaos behind?" Wren asked. Ronan glanced at her. "Leaving," she shrugged. "The constant deals, the pressure, the endless cycle of more," he exhaled slowly. "I wouldn't know how." She gave a small chuckle, shaking her head. "You say that like it's impossible." He considered that. "And you, would you ever walk away from what you've built?" She was quiet for a moment before answering. "No, but I built something I love. I don't feel like I'm chasing anything." That hit him harder than it should have. They reached a small park, the kind tucked between buildings, a quiet escape from the city's intensity. Wren stepped onto the grass, tilting her head up to the night sky. "You ever just look up?" she asked. Ronan followed her gaze. "At what?" She gestured toward the stars. "At everything." "At nothing. Just to remind yourself that you're small in the grand scheme of things." He had never thought about it that way. His world had always been about control, about ensuring every detail was accounted for. Looking up at something vast and uncontainable wasn't something he did. But standing there beside her, he tried. Wren turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "You're always carrying something, Ronan." His jaw tensed. "It's part of the job." "No," she said gently. "It's part of you." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. Instead, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. She didn't pull away, and for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Days passed, then weeks, and without realizing it, Ronan found himself seeking her out more and more. His driver knew to take detours past her cafe. His schedule mysteriously opened up on nights when she was free. He told himself he was simply enjoying something different, something uncomplicated. But nothing about the way he felt for Wren was simple. One evening, she was closing up when he arrived, carrying a takeout bag from an upscale restaurant. "You bringing me dinner now?" she teased, locking the door behind her. "You forget to eat when you're busy," he pointed out. She eyed him, amused. "And you know that because I pay attention." She looked at him for a long moment before shaking her head. "You're impossible." He handed her the bag, "but thoughtful." She sighed dramatically. "Fine, you get points for that." They sat on a bench outside, the city buzzing in the distance. "Why do you work so late?" Ronan asked as she took a bite of her food. "Why do you?" she countered. He huffed a quiet laugh. "Fair." She leaned back, stretching out her legs. "I love what I do, but sometimes I forget to slow down." He studied her. "You told me once that people should do things that force them to stop." She smiled. "And look at you actually listening." "I listened to you." Something flickered in her gaze, something vulnerable. "Yeah," she murmured. "I know." The moment stretched, the air between them shifting. Ronan wasn't a man who hesitated. But with Wren, he found himself wanting to savor every second. So when he reached out, when his fingers brushed her cheek, he didn't rush. And when she leaned in, closing the space between them, it wasn't hurried. It was inevitable. Ronan had always believed love was a distraction, something that complicated the clean-cut efficiency of his life. But Wren wasn't a distraction. She was the only thing that made sense. He realized it one morning when he woke up earlier than usual, his phone buzzing with notifications. Normally, he would have checked them immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Wren, still asleep beside him, her hair spread across the pillow. And just like that, the urgency of everything else faded. She stirred, blinking up at him. "You're staring," he smirked. "You're beautiful," she groaned, burying her face in the pillow. "That's unfair, I just woke up." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Still true." She peeked up at him, searching his expression. "You ever let yourself just be?" he exhaled, his fingers tracing slow circles on her back. "I do now," she smiled, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "Good." And for the first time in his life, Ronan Barrett let the world wait. Ronan had never imagined that something as simple as walking into the wrong room could change the course of his life. But here he was, standing at the edge of Wren's cafe after hours, watching her move around the space as she wiped down tables and rearranged chairs. There was something grounding about her. "You're hovering," Wren observed, not bothering to look up. "I don't hover," Ronan countered, leaning against the counter. She shot him a knowing glance. "You do when you're thinking too much," he exhaled, rolling his shoulders. She wasn't wrong. His mind had been tangled in thoughts all day about her, about what she meant to him, about how unprepared he was for how deeply she had embedded herself into his world. Wren finished what she was doing, then walked over, sliding onto the stool across from him. "All right, out with it." Ronan studied her for a moment, then set his phone down on the counter. "You ever think about how strange it is that we met the way we did?" She tilted her head. "What, you mean how a billionaire in a three-piece suit wandered into my yoga class and nearly fell over trying to leave?" His lips twitched. "Something like that." She rested her elbow on the counter, propping her chin in her hand. "I don't think it's strange. I think it was meant to happen." That made him pause. "You believe in that kind of thing?" She considered for a moment. "I believe that sometimes the universe puts people exactly where they need to be, even if they don't realize why at first." Ronan wasn't sure he had ever believed in fate, but as he looked at her, the way she made him feel, the way she had softened the sharp edges of his world, he wondered if maybe, just this once, she was right. "I never expected you," he admitted. Wren smiled, reaching across the counter to trace her fingers over the back of his hand. "I never expected you either." They sat there for a while, the quiet hum of the city outside their only background noise. Then, after a long pause, Wren spoke again. "You're scared." Ronan's jaw tightened. "I don't get scared." She gave him a look that told him she wasn't buying it. "You've spent your whole life controlling everything around you, but you can't control this, can you?" He didn't answer because she already knew. Wren squeezed his hand. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." Ronan had spent years making sure he was untouchable, ensuring that nothing and no one could ever throw him off balance. But Wren had walked into his life and done exactly that. And instead of fighting it for the first time, he wanted to let himself fall. The next night, Ronan surprised her. Wren had just finished locking up when she turned to find him standing beside the curb, his car idling behind him. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you kidnapping me?" Ronan opened the passenger door. "I'm taking you somewhere." She eyed him suspiciously but slid inside. "This better not be some over-the-top billionaire stunt," he chuckled, closing the door behind her before getting into the driver's seat. "No private jets, I promise." She settled in as he pulled onto the road. "Where are we going? You'll see." They drove for a while, leaving the city behind until they reached a quiet stretch of coastline. Ronan parked near the cliffs, then stepped out, waiting for her to follow. Wren got out, shivering slightly as a cool breeze rolled in. "All right, I'll bite." "What's the occasion?" Ronan motioned toward the open sky. "You told me once that I should look up." She followed his gaze, her breath catching slightly as she took in the vast stretch of stars above them. "You brought me out here just to look at the sky?" she asked, her voice softer now. He nodded. "I wanted to try it, with you." Wren turned toward him, something unreadable in her expression. Then, without a word, she slipped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. Ronan froze for a fraction of a second before wrapping his arms around her, holding her close. They stood there in silence, the waves crashing below, the stars stretching endlessly above them. And for the first time in his life, Ronan Barrett wasn't thinking about what came next. He was just here with her. Days passed, then weeks, and somehow Wren had become the center of his world. Ronan had never been the kind of man to prioritize anything outside of his business, but now he found himself making time adjusting meetings, shifting schedules, ensuring that no matter how chaotic his life got, Wren was always a part of it. It was a dangerous thing, caring this much. But he didn't care. One evening, Wren was closing up when she turned to find him waiting by the door. She grinned. "You really don't know how to take a night off, do you?" Ronan stepped forward, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Come with me." She arched an eyebrow. "Where?" He held out his hand. "Trust me." She hesitated for a second before taking it. He led her outside where a sleek motorcycle was parked against the curb. Wren blinked. "You ride." "On occasion." She let out a laugh, shaking her head. "You never stop surprising me." Ronan handed her a helmet. "Hop on." She eyed him before taking it. "If I die, I'm haunting you." He smirked. "No," he grinned. "Noted." She climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist as he started the engine. And as they sped off into the night, Wren's laughter ringing in his ears, Ronan realized something. He wasn't just falling for her. He had fallen, completely, irrevocably. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what that meant. Ronan had never thought of himself as the kind of man who would rearrange his life for someone. His schedule had always been immovable, his priorities fixed. But then came Wren, slipping into his world with her quiet certainty, her ability to make him stop and actually feel. He found himself pausing during meetings, checking the time to see how long it would be before he could see her again. His employees had started exchanging knowing glances whenever he left the office earlier than usual, which was unheard of before her. And now, standing outside her cafe after closing, watching her stack chairs and wipe down tables, he knew something had shifted permanently inside him. This wasn't just a fleeting distraction. It wasn't just an indulgence. It was everything. Wren glanced up, catching him watching her. "You're hovering again." "I told you, I don't hover." She wiped her hands on a towel and walked over, stopping in front of him. "You've been staring at me for the last 5 minutes, Barrett," he exhaled, reaching out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "I like watching you," she arched a brow. "That makes you sound like a stalker." He let out a quiet chuckle. "I prefer the term invested observer." She shook her head, but he caught the hint of a smile before she turned away to lock the door. When she turned back, he caught her hand. "Come with me," she eyed him curiously. "Where?" Ronan didn't answer. Instead, he led her to his car, opening the door for her. Wren hesitated for only a moment before sliding inside. They drove in comfortable silence, the city lights giving way to quieter roads. After about 20 minutes, Ronan pulled onto a private drive, the car rolling to a stop in front of a house that overlooked the water. Wren stepped out, taking in the view. "This is yours." "One of them." She turned to him, crossing her arms. "You brought me to one of your houses in the middle of the night. Should I be concerned?" Ronan stepped closer, brushing his fingers against hers. "I wanted to show you something." She raised an eyebrow but let him lead her inside. The house was modern but not cold. Large windows framed the ocean, the sound of waves filling the space. He guided her through the living area and out onto the deck, where a fire pit was already burning, casting a warm glow against the dark sky. Wren looked around, then back at him. "Okay, I'll admit. This is nice." He motioned for her to sit, then took the seat beside her. "I used to come here when I needed to think, when the weight of everything got too heavy." She studied him, her expression softer now, and now, his gaze held hers. "Now I just wanted to bring you here." Wren was quiet for a moment, then reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I'm glad you did." For a while they just sat there, the fire crackling between them, the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the cliffs. Then, without warning, Wren spoke. "What happens next, Ronan?" He turned to her. "What do you mean?" She shifted slightly, pulling her knees up to her chest. "You're this force. You move through life like nothing can touch you, but this," she gestured between them, "this is real. And I need to know if you're all in." Ronan had spent his life making calculated decisions, weighing risks before making a move. But this wasn't business, this was Wren, and there was only one answer. "I'm all in," he said without hesitation. She searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt. When she found none, a slow smile spread across her lips. "Good." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're stuck with me now," she sighed dramatically. "Guess I'll have to learn to live with your billionaire ways," he chuckled, tightening his hold on her. "I think you'll manage." And just like that, the last of his doubts faded, because this was it, she was it. Weeks passed and their lives intertwined effortlessly. Ronan had never been happier, never felt more grounded. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of her cafe after closing, Wren stretched out beside him, staring at the sky. "You know, I never thought I'd fall for someone like you." He turned his head, watching her. "Like me," she smirked. "You know, mysterious billionaire with a brooding past." He huffed a quiet laugh. "I don't brood." She shot him a look. "Oh, you brood, but I like it." He reached over, tracing his fingers along her wrist. "And I never thought I'd fall for someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew." She turned toward him, her voice softer now. "Is that a good thing?" He brushed his thumb over the bracelet he had given her all those weeks ago. "It's the best thing." Wren's gaze held his, something unspoken passing between them. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he sat up, reaching into his pocket. Wren frowned. "Are you about to give me another ridiculously expensive gift?" he smirked, then shook his head. "Not a gift." Before she could respond, he pulled out a small velvet box and flipped it open. Wren's breath caught. Inside was a ring, simple yet stunning. Ronan held her gaze. "Marry me." She let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "Just like that," he nodded. "Just like that." She looked down at the ring, then back at him, her eyes shining. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She exhaled, then reached for the ring, slipping it onto her finger. Then she looked up at him, her smile wide and breathtaking. "Well then, I guess we're doing this." Ronan pulled her into his arms, kissing her fiercely. Because from the moment he had walked into that yoga studio by accident, his life had been leading him here, to her, and he wasn't letting go. Months later, they stood in front of a small group of family and friends, exchanging vows in a private ceremony overlooking the cliffs where he had first realized he loved her. Wren looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I never thought someone like you would be my forever." Ronan traced his fingers along her jaw. "And I never thought someone like you would make me believe in forever." The officiant smiled. "Then, by the power vested in me," Ronan didn't wait for the rest. He pulled Wren into his arms, kissing her deeply as the sound of the ocean filled the air. Laughter and applause surrounded them, but all Ronan could focus on was the woman in his arms, his wife, his future, his everything.